Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Alice, and I'm very pleased that you're here. I'm going to kick things off with a few logistics, and then I'm going to introduce today's speakers. So just before we get started, if you have any questions for our presenters, enter them into the questions panel. If we have time during the presentation, we'll answer some along the way. And definitely at the end, we'll reserve a few minutes for Q&A. So go ahead and type your questions as you think of them into that questions panel, and we're happy to answer all your questions. Now I'd like to introduce our two speakers, Steve Spear and Patrick Stoy. Steve is a 5-time Shingo Prize, Crosby Medal, and McKinsey Award winner, author of Decoding the DNA of the Toyota Production System and the High Velocity Edge, as well as a senior lecturer at MIT. He's worked across a spectrum of heavy industry and high-tech services, government, and military organizations. And I know many of you are familiar with his work already. Joining Steve is Patrick Stoy. He's a leader in drug discovery with 2 decades of experience in drug R&D in a couple of different companies where, as a team leader and a group director, he had a lot of experience applying lean and agile practices to his work. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Steve, and I'll be back to moderate some Q&A later in the presentation.
All right, Alice, thank you so much for getting us started, getting us set up, and everyone who's making time today, either live now or whoever watches it remote recorded after the fact. Again, thank you for investing your time with us. Hope it works out well. To Alice's point, again, because of the way the webinar is set up, we can't actually hear you interrupting, but feel free to interrupt. So throw questions into the comments, and I will try not to ramble too much, take some pause so Alice can intercede with a question here, question there for clarification, elaboration, color commentary, whatever you want to do. Let's make this as, given this format, as conversational as possible. So anyway, what we're talking about here is Andon and Jidoka, and I deliberately picked those terms because those tie so much back to Toyota Production System, Toyota Inspiration for Lean. But the purpose of today's presentation is to kind of make those relevant in a contemporary fashion. And I actually want to, you'll see some of my slides. I'll start probably going on a rant around a pet peeve that even for the community that looked at Toyota for inspiration going back 10, 20, even 30 years, that this notion of Andon and Jidoka is not nearly as well appreciated and consequently not as nearly well practiced as some of the other things Toyota introduced in terms of like value stream maps and pull systems, just-in-time standard work, 5S, Pokeyoke, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, for those of you who are deep into the lean community, hope this sort of says, oh, you know, I really have to pay some attention to that too. And for those who aren't, may have heard some of these terms, I hope you say, well, this is relevant even though I don't make turned metal parts that are fabricated and assembled. Anyway, in terms of the challenge we're talking about, and again, throw into the chat, you know, whether you think this is true or not, is that when we go and try to solve society's problems, and really that's what work is, right? We get together and we try to solve a problem. Sometimes it's a lofty problem, kind of in the Mother Teresa kind of realm of things, and sometimes it's just, you know, someone has a need, someone has a want, someone has a desire. But what we have to do is we have to form up a fairly large group of people with their own particular specialty and expertise. And of course, the issue is if we just get all those people together, we still have nothing. We just have a lot of, it's like having parts on the table. We don't have any kind of functioning apparatus. And so the real challenge for us is to not only assemble the masses of experts, specialists in this, specialists in that, but make sure that they're working in some coordination, harmonization towards some kind of a collaborative common purpose. And that, as the big fig used to say, that's the tricky part. So anyway, this issue of aligning all these different disparate pieces so they start moving in the same direction effectively. So we really do get a situation where the whole is not just the sum of the parts, but much, 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 much greater than the sum of the parts. I'll assert, and again, throw into the chat whether you believe this or not, I'll assert that this is actually a fairly universal problem. And this is not sector dependent. So for example, when, you know, and Alice was very nice to mention a couple of the recognition I've gotten for some of my writing. Most of that is in the lower left-hand quadrant of this diagram, which is, I spent a lot of time embedded in Toyota, so that's production is the operating environment. And we took a lot of lessons away from Toyota and the genius of their management system around how you get all these disparate parts lined up, harmonized, choreographed in the same direction. That issue, though, is certainly not limited to shop floors. It's also a bedside problem in terms of delivering care to patients who need care, comfort, and cure. I don't know if next time you go to the doctor, even just for, quote unquote routine exam, notice the number of different touch points you have going through the system between the people doing the clerical work, medical assistants, registered nurses, nurse practitioners, the physician, therapists, physician assistants, billing, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm willing to bet that as you go through the system, again, just for a quote unquote routine exam, your number of touch points is about a dozen. Now you go into something that's just really serious where you need some kind of really significant diagnosis and therapy, you're starting to get into the many dozens of people. I mean, it is a lot of complexity, and it's not just the science, the engineering, the technology complexity. It's the organizational complexity, which if it doesn't come together, we suffer the frustrations we suffer with healthcare delivery, but if it comes together, it's something magnificent. Anyway, well, we've looked at the kind of the first two quadrants. The left side of this chart is thinking about problems or the problem is the choreography, the harmonization of people doing already the execution, the operation kind of work. What I'd like to offer is that the challenges we're talking about aren't just on the left side with already existing operations and systems. It's for this really lofty conceptual work of discovering new things, designing new things, developing new things, and that sort of stuff. And that's where my friend and colleague Patrick comes in, because he's one of these lofty conceptual thinkers. He's got a PhD in some really sort of advanced science that most of us couldn't even understand his dissertation, let alone his day-to-day work. And he works with other people who have really sort of highfalutin fancy degrees and also highfalutin fancy sciences. And he'll talk about how this issue of collaboration, harmonization, coordination towards common purpose is an issue in the sector of discovering new therapeutics. And for those listening to this, I imagine that, oops, sorry for that. Back to our nice little grid. I think for those listening to this, you'll recognize the what I hope is the obvious analogy that this stuff that Patrick is talking about in terms of getting all these pieces to come together for the discovery of a great thing. In his case, a compound that can enter the body and get the body's things to behave better. That's a set of common problems. Anytime we get experts together to design and invent and create new complex systems, IT systems, airplanes, automobiles, whatever else. Anyway, just as a quick pause before moving on, just to get a sense of who's listening, where the interest might be. We got a little poll. So Alice, if you'll pop it up. And the nature of the poll is this, which is of the various quadrants we popped up on the screen here, which are the one or two, of these, which is the one that best describes your day-to-day commitments. Are you in an operating environment, a conceptual environment? Are you in an industrial environment, non-industrial environment? Anyway, those are quadrants 1, 2, 3, and 4. And while you're thinking that through and clicking on one of the radio buttons, let me just offer that these issues of harmonization, harmonization, choreography, that kind of thing. Look, neither Patrick nor I invented this. That the left side of this, sort of those first two quadrants on the left side, that's where the lean people have really had a lot to say over the years in terms of how you get the pieces together into some kind of meaningful, harmonious whole. And the agile people have really had a lot to say about how we harmonize work for the development, creation of new systems. The agile, the dev community. Anyway, there we are, and let's see. It's kind of a lot of operational people. Yeah, all right, we got some in healthcare delivery. Not surprisingly, quadrant 3, the quadrant that Patrick occupies, there aren't many people. And you know what? You know why that is? Because there aren't many people like Patrick who do this kind of work. But thank God there are, because otherwise our lives would be ones of misery and suffering far beyond what they actually are. And so anyway, let's keep going with this. So where I'll start my pieces, familiar to me, I'll start in that lower left-hand quadrant. Again, that's how I tie in to my fellow shop rats and factory rats and all of that. We'll pop up to the healthcare and come across. But here's the thing: as I started with this presentation, I said this idea of Jidoka and Andon, even for the folks, the fellow factory rats. My concern is that for all the attention paid to Toyota, those concepts, which create the possibility of feedback into a system which is dynamic, self-stabilizing, self-correcting, that those concepts are too often overlooked. So I hope it has meaning there. And for the rest of you, I hope it offers some like, oh, I didn't know they do that. So anyway, let's pick this up. So over bottom right-hand corner, or bottom left-hand corner, sorry. So Toyota. So those of you in the lean community have seen some version of the Toyota temple drawn, and it has so many different convolutions and combinations. I've seen it with 2 pillars, 3 pillars, 8 pillars. I don't know, people like pillars. Turns out when I see Toyota build this, they build it up with 2 pillars. And I'll explain why that is because the left pillar, the just-in-time stuff, is a big part of the contribution, the inspiration of one of the main architects of the Toyota production system. That's Taiichi Ohno. And I've got his book over here. If you haven't read Taiichi Ohno's book on the Toyota production system, recommend it highly. And not only should you read it, but you should order it right away. It's not in print any longer. And if you want to get a copy of that book, you have to go to a used book vendor like Ames Books or one of those others. And you just don't know how many books are left, and you don't. I just ordered some for some students who are graduating this year, and they're getting the special version published in India or for India, whatever. Anyway, get Ohno's book; it's fantastic. But anyway, why 2 pillars? The pillar on the left is what Toyota thinks is essential about designing and operating a system, and the pillar on the right, and I'll explain that, is what they think is essential in terms of making it possible to improve a system. So anyway, let's look a little bit further on this whole just-in-time and Jidoka thing. So first, the just-in-time, and I think this is, for the factory rats out there, this is probably familiar. For those of you who aren't factory rats, but have heard it, probably familiar. So a little bit of a review here. So you think about what the essence of a just-in-time system is. It's cutting through all the sort of bastardized Japanese terms and this thing and that thing. Basically, it's guidance on how to design a complex operating system in a methodical, reliable fashion. And so in order to have just-in-time, what do you need to do? Well, first, you need to make some declaration about what the point of the system is. What's our target output? The mix of what we're trying to, product or service we're trying to deliver, the volume, the timing, the destination, et cetera, et cetera. There has to be purposefulness to a system before we can actually design it. And all right, so anyway, define the target output. Second thing is that once you've established what you think you're trying to generate, you have to set up an architecture, a system actually, and that means creating a flow of work. This is step 1, this is step 2, this is step 3. Patrick has step 1, Alice has step 2, Steve has step 3. You have to create a flow. Now, so far, so good. There's nothing in what I've said so far, combination of purposefulness and roles and responsibilities, I guess, which separates just-in-time from anything else. Now, this is where the separation starts, which is within the just-in-time idea. What you do is you put in these connections one step to the next, so that the system becomes self-synchronizing, it becomes self-pacing, it becomes self-coordinating without the need for some very expensive, heavy-handed production control, material management system on top. And for those of you who have, want to really get into the nitty-gritty details on this, feel free to grab, I think it's online, we may have offered it, chapter 6 out of my book, talks about the design of such systems so that they're naturally self-synchronizing. But anyway, that gets us to the left side. Anyway, the topic of this conversation today is not the left side, so we'll move on to the Jidoka side. So where does Jidoka come in? Jidoka comes in by the invention attributed to the founder of the whole Toyota empire, Sakichi Toyota. And here's the story. And I'm going to tell this story, and one, I think it's kind of interesting, but it's also interesting that this is how Toyota explains Jidoka in their own environment. It's not just, oh, here's a methodology, like, I don't know, how to calculate the slope of a line. They tell the principle wrapped in a story, because that's how we convey value as human beings in our cultures and our societies. We don't just give, I don't know, thou shalt not kill. That's fine. But we tell it in the concept that there's Moses and he's walking through the desert with 600,000 people, and they get to this mountain. He goes up in a cloud, and it's revealed to him. And that whole story is what gives the rule, or it helps give the rule, a contextual value. So anyway, within Toyota, this Jidoka thing's important. So here's the mythology, and I don't mean it false. I just a story with value that the folks at Toyota give. So Sakichi Toyota is a young man, late teens, late teens, and the U.S. has told Japan, given them an ultimatum to open up after 400 years of self-imposed isolation. They've got to open up to the outside world, trade and that sort of thing. And there's this big sort of existential crisis in Japan called the Meiji Restoration. And he's part of it, which is young people in Japan are trying to figure out how to maintain their independence, how to maintain their cultural integrity while being forced to open up to the West. And Sakichi Toyota's contribution to this is, in the way they tell the story, is that he's in his home village, and he's observing just how hardworking the women in that village are trying to weave fabric. And you think about it, you go back to this original diagram. The story starts with people doing something that someone else will appreciate, that target output. And what he observes is that as they're doing their work, they're unaware that a thread in the loom has broken. And because they're unaware of that, they continue to weave. And this is hard. I mean, it's not like you press a button. This is, you pull this, you push that, you step on this, you step on that. It's like Pilates with fabric coming out at the end. And Toyota, Mr. Toyota, realizes that once the thread breaks, the work is pointless. And people are doing something which will be of far less value and far less appreciated than it would be without the broken thread, without the run of the fabric. And the way they tell the story, it breaks his young adult heart to see people working so hard in a way that won't be appreciated. So he gets this idea. If you could get the loom to be self-reflective enough to actually stop and indicate where the thread broke, then the person operating the loom wouldn't have this risk of working on a piece of fabric which has a run in it and less value. Someone would know to restring the thread and never be in a position where what they're doing is working on defects, something unappreciated. Anyway, as far as this goes with Mr. Toyota, he actually invents a loom which has exactly that property. A thread breaks, a little flag pops up, the operator looks and says, oh, this thing needs to be rethreaded. Oh, good for me. I never make something with a run in it. He patents that idea. He sells the right to use the patent to the British, who are the big shots in textiles in the late 1800s. And the royalties off that patent, that becomes a seed money for Toyota Motor. So anyway, Toyota actually still is in the textile business. And they probably do it because they need textiles in the cars. And there may be economic reason to still be in the textile business. But I think part of the reason they're still in the textile business is Mr. Toyota was a textile guy. And his big contribution to humanity was looms that would stop running if the thread broke. Anyway, expanding on this, back to our talk. This thing about Jidoka, that when a thread breaks, the loom stops, is not just sort of a literal principle for the folks at Toyota. they came to the realization, why would we ever ask someone to do work and continue to do the work after the work broke? And so for those of you who are deep into this lean stuff, you know, the whole list of tools and practices which have the capability of making problems visible. See a problem. And how does this play out in the work environment? Is that when someone is doing work and that person, he or she, encounters a problem in the Toyota environment, they pull a cord, an Andon cord, and like this gentleman here standing there, reaching up, pulling a cord and saying, boop, I have a problem here. And it lights up. And what is this? This is a manifestation for a human being of that little flag with the broken thread on Sakichi Toyota's loom. And what happens when someone pulls that? The problem gets escalated. The problem gets escalated. And how does it get escalated? That the team member, the associate who has that problem, pulls the cord, and nearly immediately a team lead comes over and says, Patrick, what's the problem? How can I be helpful? And if the team lead can't resolve the problem, then a group lead comes over and says, hey, team lead, what's the problem you're having resolving the problem of the associate, and how can I be helpful? And this goes all the way up. There's actually no end to how far this could escalate if someone can't come over and meaningfully help resolve the problem that affected the person. Now, let's start thinking about the power of this Andon, right, which is closely tied to Jidoka, right? Jidoka is the ability to see the break, and Andon is the ability to, once it's seen, to escalate it. Well, two advantages. The first one is that let's say I'm doing my work, and I misfire and I strip a bolt. All right. Well, and I've actually had this experience, not in a Toyota. What do I do then? I scramble, because now I got a stripped bolt. I got to get the bolt out. That's hard to do. I got to find another bolt. I got to insert that. If I strip the first one, probably there's something wrong with me. That's probably the first explanation, that I don't know even how to fire the bolt without stripping it. And you can see how that little problem of just one stripped bolt starts to spin out of control and really is disruptive and distracting to me. And because people depend on me and I'm depending on other people, if I get flabbergasted in my work, then the person who's behind me sending me stuff can't send it to me, so I messed up behind me. And the person dependent on me, they can't proceed. Why? Because I'm all flabbergasted. I'm not actually doing my job because I've got this strip bolt. So what is this combination of Jidoka plus Andon do? Well, first pass, it stabilizes the system, because you've got this very dynamic system. You've got this momentary localized disruption, and that disruption, all it wants to do is spread. That's what it wants to do, like in the example I gave you with the strip bolt. But with the Jidoka, oh, I see the problem, the Andon, I need some help. The help comes over. What do you contain the problem. Here, associate, let me help you resolve that problem. So it's contained in time, it's contained in space, it's contained sort of in terms of emotional energy. So everything around you can continue. All right, so if that's all it did, we'd say yay for Jidoka and yay for Andon, just for the stabilization of these otherwise chaotic, systems that otherwise want to be chaotic. But there's another piece. What's the other piece? Is that it's a human being who experiences the problem, and certainly it's a human being who comes over to see the problem. And by seeing the problem and swarming it, the problem can be solved. And it can be solved because not only is the problem swarmed, but it's swarmed while it's still hot. And so it can be investigated. And so when we start looking at Toyota and just the way in which they've, for, I don't know, it's now 30, 40 years where they've just decimated their competitors in the auto industry. I say, why is that? We could say, well, you can give a whole lot of credit to the stuff on the just-in-time side. It's a much simpler way to set up a system. It's a clearer way to set up a system. It's easier to design a system that's just in time. It's easier to operate a system that's just in time. But here's the other thing, the Jidoka piece. Without Jidoka, it's very hard to keep such a dynamic system moving in harmony. And when there's a disruption someplace without Jidoka and without Andon, it's very, very hard to contain the problem. It's very hard to improve. On the other hand, I think the evidence is overwhelming. On the other hand, that with the presence of Jidoka and with the presence of Andon, not only can you have incredibly reliable systems, but you can have systems which are improving and self-correcting at a pace, at a duration, a breadth that no one else in the industry can match. So anyway, let me just pause and check with Alice and see if we've got any questions coming in so far.
Yeah, hi, Steve. Yeah, we do have a few questions coming in.
Fire away.
All right. Well, we'll get right to that then. There's a few. So one question is it correct to say that Andon is like the nervous system of the body?
Oh, beautiful question. Thank you for asking that. So the answer is yes, 100%. And Patrick is a life scientist, and he's shaking his head yes, so I'm not going too far off on the limb.
Right on.
Right on, right? It's exactly that. Is that you start thinking, all right, first of all, I'm so excited with that question. So the term Jidoka, and I think we have to tie Jidoka and Andon together. The term Jidoka gets translated from automation into English to automation with a human touch. And sometimes it gets translated into autonomation. And there's a very elegant, beautiful way in that the word automation written in Japanese characters, they put a little human character inside to give the human touch thing. But here's what I think that means. First of all, it's humanistic that a broken thing stops and tells you it's broken. But this notion of autonomic, right? So we all have autonomic systems, which is all that stuff that happens out of sight, out of mind, just naturally self-correcting. So like, for example, today, you wake up, you forget to eat breakfast. So what? All right, you're a little bit hungry, maybe a little bit grumpy, but you function. Why is that? Because autonomically, your body is sending out hormones here, hormones there, responses this, responses that, to adjust your blood sugar. You're late for something, you run down the block. Do you have to think to breathe harder and have your heart rate go up to start perspiring and then to cool down? No, you don't. Why is that? Autonomic systems. It's these systems which have this dynamic feedback where when something starts going out of whack, something else tracks it to give the appearance of everything being in whack, I guess. And so anyway, a fantastic question, because that's exactly, I mean, not even an approximation of the impact of having Jidoka plus Andon in a system. It gives a very complex, very dynamic system, which is prone to all sorts of disarray. It gives that system the capacity for self-regulation, self-correction. So anyway, fantastic question.
And also,
Alice,
for those of you out there
ahead,
who might have diabetes or know somebody who does, you'll know when the system gets out of whack, when there isn't that fast feedback, automatic response, how hard it is to live your life, right? I think that's
right.
a great example.
Yeah, Patrick, that's great. I mean, because diabetes is the antithesis of autonomic, which is a diabetic can function well, but it requires so much calculation, preparation, adherence to plan that and why is that? Because they don't have this sort of out of sight, out of mind systems self-correcting all the time. Patrick and I were talking about this American cross-country skier, a guy named Chris Freeman, arguably one of the best American cross-country skiers, but on top of that, the guy was doing it all with type 1 diabetes. And the amount of calculation, formulation he had to do before a race in terms of knowing the race course, knowing how hard he would exert, when he would stop for food breaks, how to set his insulin pump. I mean, the flow chart on this thing, it had to be like 49 yards long. If he does a 15-kilometer race, he's carrying along with him a recipe which is probably of any equal distance, equal length. Anyway, what happens with this guy, Chris Freeman, at one point, he's in the lead pack of some, major race. And he realizes if he can hang with the big boys, he's got a legitimate shot at a medal. And so he also knows if he doesn't hang with this pack, then he might finish, lose contention. So he starts picking up and going with the pack. Problem is, that wasn't built into the plan. What's the problem? Now, most people, all right, so they breathe hard, they work hard, they turn a little purple in the face, right? And that's, oh, he showed grit, he showed determination. Problem with Chris Freeman is he had a schedule of how hard he could exert, how many, BTUs he could expend per minute. He had how many calories he was going to take in at different points, and had his insulin pump set. What happens? He violated the program, and he literally crashes. There's he going along with the pack. Then he crashes in the snow, and he's there for like 2-3 minutes till someone can give him something to drink to get his blood sugar levels back up. And why is that? No autonomic control over his blood sugar. Very, very fragile system, where systems which have these autonomic, and Patrick, thanks for reminding me on that, these autonomic properties, fantastically robust. Alice, back to you.
Yeah, so there are a few questions. I don't want to derail your presentation too much, but there's another one here that I think is worth bringing up. And I'll just generally say, we have a number of people who've commented on how much Jidoka and Andon are overlooked. And so I think that that really resonated with a lot of our attendees here today.
I know, mate.
And one question here, this person says, when I taught this stuff, I tried to convince students that Jidoka is the long lead pillar of the two. Have you had success convincing clients to do Jidoka first? Most clients want to do the production control system stuff first.
Oh man, fantastic question. So yeah, look, this is a whole other sort of extemporaneous rant I can go on how we teach people to manage, but I'll try to keep the rant short. That we teach people to manage transactionally. You know, here's some data, do some calculations, arrive at a decision. The just-in-time side of it, you know, the just-in-time pillar appears, and in the case in true practice Toyota, it's not, but it appears to be transactional. You know, sit down, Patrick, what do you think? Maybe we should conduct a value stream analysis today. Good deal. Let's assign that to have someone in assign, you know, allocate hours for the value stream map. And what else should we do, Patrick? I'm thinking perhaps we should take this job shop configuration and make a continuous flow of that. Can we put that on a budget item? Oh, for sure. It's line item number 14, right? So the just-in-time stuff fits into how we think we should be managing. But one of the things I took away from the Toyota people is they think, look, the hard part, the easy stuff, oh yeah, it's transactional, we really understand that, but the stuff we don't understand is the stuff where we can gain advantage or really suffer detriment, and that's the discovery stuff, and the Jidoka pillar, that's discovery. You start thinking about it. Why do you need it? Because something happened you didn't plan for, something broke, right? It's like that skier, that guy Chris Freeman. He didn't anticipate having to go with the pack at that point in the race. It wasn't built into his plan. Now, had he not had diabetes, his body would have gone with his will. All right, but his body couldn't go with his will, and that's why he crashed. So anyway, just last thing, when I wrote my dissertation, and if you email me directly, I'll share with you the picture. I have in there a picture of the Toyota temple, you know, pillar of just-in-time, pillar of Jidoka, the Sakichi Toyota pillar, the Taiichi Ono pillar. And then I drew it proportional to how often that was referenced in the literature. Off the top of my head, there were 2,783 articles or books written about Toyota, kaizen, lean, etc. when I did the research in 1996. All right, we don't have a poll here, but just guess. I'll be quiet for 10 seconds. How many of those mention the term Jidoka? Three. So I think in my dissertation, I have this figure drawn proportional. So instead of a nice horizontal, you know, support, boom, the structure looks like that because it's only got one pillar, not two in practice. Alice, thank you for that great question.
Sure. I don't want to detract. We do have a few other questions coming in, but I'm thinking I should let you move on with the presentation, and maybe we'll come back to some of those at the end. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Look, I just wanted those questions were fantastic. All right, look, here's what I want to accomplish now with the next part of my piece, because I really do want to pass the baton to Patrick. So we've talked so far about this lower left-hand quadrant, right? Which is the people, you know, with a lean TPS, industrial factory rat background. You're already hearing stuff, you know, it's like, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. Ooh, that adds whatever. What I want to do is now take us up from the shop floor, stay in the operational side of things, but move from industry to non-industry. So anyway, here's a storyline I want to tell you. And again, this looks way different. This is intensive care for people with very, very serious disease. Physically, they're very, very fragile. The people who work in the setting, doctors, nurses, you know, residents, fellows, their training, their background, their professional aspirations are so wildly different from people who do fabricated, assembled parts in factories. But the problem they have is exactly the same, which is they've got all these different experts who, if they worked just on their own, you got people working very hard and accomplishing nothing at all. It's about the team coming together in well harmonized, well integrated, well choreographed means. So here's the story. So this fellow Rick Shannon, he fantastic leader. He's the top. Well, we'll send you this article if you want it. Rick was head of cardiac critical care. So these are people in intensive care with a particular set of problems, like really, really weak cardiac systems. And the problem that really started to bug the heck out of Rick was that they're taking care of these patients, and these are very sick people, and sometimes you have to get medicine into their system very, very quickly. And the way you do that is you put a catheter called a central line. It goes right into the circulatory system, and you can pump medicine in that, and it's through the body very, very quickly. The problem is you insert basically what looks like a very long straw into the circulatory system, little bacteria out there and other infectious things, like, yay for us, this is like the Autobahn of infection. And so on the one hand, you do what's the right thing for the right reason. On the other hand, you create risk for patients. And when Rick started looking at the data on the chance of getting what's called a central line associated bloodstream infection, that's happy little bacteria crawling along one of these very long flexible straws, the numbers were staggering. They were staggering. And I'll get to this in a second. Just to give you a sense of things, that for the chance of getting one of these central line infections, if you were in an intensive care unit, ran into like 1 in 5. Now think about this. You bring a loved one, you get them admitted to the hospital. You're all sorts of worried because they have a critical cardiac condition. They got some other intensive condition. That's why they're in the ICU. And you find out that they're playing basically Russian roulette, right? Yeah, actually, what's a 38 have? It has 5 shots. So they're playing Russian roulette with getting one of these central line infections. And this started driving Rick absolutely crazy, that his patients were being exposed to such risk when Rick and his colleagues are trying to do such a good job to actually provide care, comfort, and cure. So what did Rick do? He realized, taking a very Jidoka Andon kind of way, that while the symptom was one thing, was central line infections, they couldn't pin down a single cause. So what they started to do is shadow each other. And they realized, and this, obviously don't read all the detail, I can't even read it looking close with my glasses on, but when they started looking at all the different things that befuddled someone in the course of either placing one of these lines in a way that didn't channel infection, or tending to one of these lines once it's pierced the skin and is in the body, tending to it so an infection doesn't have a chance to capitalize on this nice invitation, there were dozens and dozens and dozens of things that would impede somebody. And that's when Rick had his insight. He said, we can't solve the central line infection thing with silver coat, instead of silver bullets. Quite literally, there's a silver coated catheter. That won't solve it. And we can't do it with this antibiotic pill, that antibiotic pill. What we have to do is, like Sakichi Toyota said, we have to see the individual broken thread, figure out why it broke, restring it, and then make sure that we understand well enough why it broke so it doesn't recur. Anyway, we can send you the paper, but long and short, when Rick and his colleagues tackled the central line infection problem, they came up with, and I think the number is 47 different interventions in the system, 47. And you say, well, how did any of them matter? The answer is, well, one of the 4, you just don't know, but 47 together. Check out these numbers. All right, so this is a before and after comparison. So you'll notice here, the baseline year, the number of infections that affected Rick's unit, 49. What did they get to in the year where we, sort of did before and after comparison? 3. What were the deaths due to these infections? The baseline year was 19. And for what it's worth, they were no better, but they were no worse than anybody else in the country. What did they do? They got it down to 0 deaths. And look at this crazy number. That this last line, just to explain what that 22 means, bottom, that last line, it means of every time I place a line, or how many times do I have to place a line that I'm almost sure to infect someone? Every 22 lines, they infected somebody. And on the far right, 30-fold increase in the number. I mean, this is incredible. It becomes from a dangerous environment to a pristine environment. So anyway, what did Rick do? Well, he did nothing that you would see on the just-in-time side of stuff, because he didn't have a 5S necessarily, he didn't have a poke yoke device, he didn't have single-minute exchange of dies, on and on and on. But what he did was he had a very good Jidoka Andon process, which is if someone was doing work, they understood that if they had difficulty, raise their hand. And if they raised their hand, Rick or someone else would come over and say, hey, what's the problem? How can I help? And the help being, how can I prevent the problem from recurring? So anyway, that's our healthcare example. Let me just click over forward here. Alice, how we doing?
Hey, how we're doing? We're doing great. I do want to make sure we get to Patrick's part of the presentation.
All right,
yeah,
Patrick,
you got 19 minutes.
Yeah. So here's where we go. So we've looked at operating industrial, operating non-industrial. Now we're moving over to the big brain space, which Patrick and his colleagues inhabit. And as we go through there, the expectation is that you guys will see the analogy to things like IT development, product design, et cetera. So anyway, Patrick, I'll click you and you tell me when to move forward.
Okay, thanks. First, I just want to start off by saying, that quadrant thing, it's great, but it's a bit of a fiction. We all know that each of those quadrants have a lot of tangible operational as well as a lot of thinking and conceptual. So, but I do want to focus on the thinking part, because in drug discovery, my industry, it's really all about inventing a proprietary medicine. So it's a lot about discovery, invention, design. I'm going to start off with Moore's Law. So this is a big success story. It's made possible the modern digital world. It's a nice straight line going straight up. It's actually exponential. In the pharmaceutical industry, unfortunately, we have to contend with something else, something called Ahm's Law. This is sort of the negative reciprocal. And unfortunately, that's the exponential drop in R&D efficiency over time. So more and more expensive to push out one marketed drug for patients and for the industry. And it's a complex multifactorial problem why this is, but it's really the big picture problem we have to contend with to try to get better and faster. And by the way, there is no Professor Arum, it's just Moore spelled backwards, just so you don't have to figure that out. Very good, so if you go to the next one. So in my space, so I'm a trained organic chemist, I'm gonna talk about the hit to lead phase that we piloted with Steve, using high velocity edge, lean and agile type principles over the past few years. And in a nutshell, basically what we do in this space, which takes about a year out of about a 15-year drug development cycle, is start out with a imperfect initial hit molecule, which barely works, kind of like prototype number one, and try to make it stick effectively to a protein that's gonna help treat a disease. And over an iterative learning cycle of designing, making, and testing compounds, that is to say molecules, we get to, if you go back one real quick, Steve, we get to sort of the lead molecule, which is sort of the advanced prototype. This is sort of the concept car, which is, proving the concept, but cannot actually be marketed yet. And then the rest of the, say, 80% of the investment is sort of polishing that into a marketed molecule. Okay, so moving on to the actual process, most of you will recognize this sort of, as a parallel universe to what you have. There's an iterative learning cycle where we design and make the molecules, that's in the chemistry side, and then biologists, in a different part of the building, say, test these molecules in biological tests, generate data, some analysis, and together we work in a sort of a learning loop to make forward progress on ever better prototypes. And we've tried to speed this up over the years, and historically it takes about 3 to 5 years to get from hit to a drug candidate, and we're successful about 1 out of 3 times. We usually fail in this business. Actually, from this starting hit to a marketed drug, you may have a 1 out of 50 chance of succeeding. So if you ever wonder why drugs are so expensive, it's all about that, Ahm's Law, and about the very high failure rate and how long it takes to get to market. So traditional approaches to this, of course, many people try to figure this out, just work harder, throw more resource at it, make more parallel learning loops at once, and also employ technological solutions like automation. And all that seems to work on the micro level, but you know what? Historically, those 3 to 5 year product development cycles haven't shortened. We haven't squashed it down to 1 to 2 years. Why is that? So we try to take another look, and using a lot of Steve's philosophy, we try to optimize for learning speed instead of accelerating the mechanical process. So where we started is diagnosing is where are time and learning lost in the system, and our solutions were to increase the learning yield of each design, make, test cycle by really extracting out as much knowledge as we could by frequent team discussions and feedback. So here is the conceptual analog of the stripped bolt, okay? Where if you have frequent team discussions about design, you can see problems in the thinking process before they translate into doing and trigger a tremendous amount of downstream work and a huge resource footprint, through many silos and so forth. And that's really what triggers a lot of the cost and the time that it takes to discover drugs. And we're wrong most of the time. So the idea was to basically catch problems earlier when they can be thought experiments. And then also parallel with this is to increase the speed by synchronizing work between silos, limiting work in progress, not to have people overworked, so they just actually have the time to think things through and collaborate more, which is a little counterintuitive because historically it's like go faster by head down, work harder, right? Work weekends, nights, but really that's not the solution. That's counterproductive to collaboration and design. So if you go to the next slide, the way we started is the way most people start when they want to improve something is map out the process. So this is sort of a process of 3 design, make, test cycles in sort of the idealized case. This is what we expected would typically happen in the real world based on the times it took for all these individual segments of people and tasks as they move through time. And it turned out should take about 50 days to get through 3 iterative learning cycles. Okay, so when we actually looked at the data of some of our best programs, if you go to the next one, we were actually fairly horrified. We investigated sort of forensically these 2 programs, A and B, which were our top programs, which we were proud of and we thought are great successes. And we saw that the actual design, make, test cycles took twice or 4 times as long as we expected. And these were not, those 51 days is not sort of the optimal process. That's just sort of general in the real world, what you might expect. So we wondered, well, what is the problem? And again, we forensically reconstructed these programs and mapped it out again. And what we saw was an awful lot of delays, rework, the typical spaghetti diagram, sort of analogous to the hidden factory problem that some of you may be familiar with. Once you look under the hood, you see all kind of horrors and problems and fiascos that don't really make it to the top level. And very, very interestingly, when we started this, we anticipated, well, we know we're going to find problems, but the problems are going to be probably with others, them, the other people we rely on to, for example, test the data, get us back data, ship compounds around. But when we investigated it, candidly, we found no, it was actually all us, the chemistry team, and the problems were really inadequate knowledge sharing, alignment around goals, inadequate teaching and learning, essentially. So a lot of individual hard working by very competent, diligent, motivated people, just too individual. It wasn't enough of a team sport in the conceptual phase. And what happens is, like that broken thread of the loom, a lot of work was allowed to go on for a very long time that was really besides the fact, that really wasn't contributing to the overall mission and adding value. And if you go to the next slide, this is sort of how we approached it. So our sort of starting state was sort of the typical silo problem you encounter in a lot of large organizations where chemistry, biology, and a lot of other silos not shown here are sort of separated and need to be joined up more, but also internal to those silos. The people were working too much as individual contributors and really weren't collaborating enough in the design and make parts of this. So if you click on one more, the way we were really able to make forward progress is by changing the conversation. So instead of, for example, twice monthly team meetings when people would typically say, this is what I've done for the last 2 weeks. We changed it to a more frequent weekly meeting where we focused on what are we going to do in the next week as individuals and as a team, and why? What's the thinking behind it? What's the hypothesis behind it? Why do you think that's true? Why do you think this will work? And it was really all about making the thinking visible and pressure testing it and learning and teaching. And as anybody who's tried to do this sort of thing, it's fantastically hard. It is totally non-trivial because that's not how people are generally wired. Generally, this requires people to make their precious ideas that they love visible, and it's very vulnerable to have, in front of the boss to say, this is what I think and this is why, and then to be proved wrong, very often week after week, and then to dissect, well, this is why I may have been wrong, and this is what we're going to do next time, or this is why we should stop this work because it's wrong. Let's redirect, and as a team go in another direction. So making that psychologically safe space to have that small team discussion about that fast and early feedback on the design and thinking, that's really the core of what made the difference, and it's very difficult to do as a leader and as a team, as a culture thing. And then, of course, if you click on the next slide, there was also a lot of other important things we did to accelerate the process about synchronizing work between, for example, the biologists that were testing and the chemists that were interpreting the data and making decisions about what to do next. So, for example, we made sure that there was the cadence and the frequency of the data coming back was aligned with our thinking and our team discussions about that data. So we burned out a lot of white space that way. But also we invited the biologists in to see how we were thinking about their data and to close the loop that way. So that all headed off a lot of problems and made the process much smoother. And that allowed a lot of the mechanical problems in the system that were previously masked and buried to come to light. And I have a lot of funny anecdotes and about all the kind of process improvement things that many of you are familiar with, like I don't know, for example, one quick one is, I wandered into the lab to have a 5-minute discussion with a chemist on a Monday to discuss a program. And I started talking to her and I noticed she had a winter coat stuffed under her lab coat, like the Stay Puft Pillsbury Man, like she could barely fit. And I also noticed it was freezing. And, why is that? So I was like, doesn't that bother you that it's freezing cold? And she said, no, not at all. Absolutely not. And she spent the next 5 minutes convincing me how it wasn't a problem, that it was so cold in the lab on a Monday and nobody could figure it out. So I encourage the team to start thinking about, when you have these small problems, try to catch them early and, don't let them cascade, figure out, well, what is the problem? And it turns out, the dates on the thermostat have drifted out of whack. And so every Sunday and Monday, which was supposed to be the weekend by the thermostat, the heating was shut down in this gigantic building, which accounted for a lot of the cost because of all the turnovers and the air turnovers in the labs. And so on a Saturday when nobody was there, it was, full on heated and air conditioned during the year. Mondays, everybody was miserable. And actually some experiments were also derailed and, thrown out of whack by the change in temperature. So these little problems actually had, cascading implications, but it was all around seeking the frustration and the pain points and saying, what's the root cause, and let's chase this down. And that's actually sort of contrary to the culture because like individual contributors, there was this sort of macho attitude of small problems, they don't bother me, I'm going to work around them, and I'm just going to work harder instead of slowing down, stopping them and figuring them out so that the entire team, the building and so forth would benefit in the long run to have a better, smoother experience. So I think I'm going to stop there, and we have about 5 more minutes for questions, comments.
Well, Patrick, you didn't get to the punchline. What was the impact?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, you have to click to the impact slide. Sorry, that didn't trigger my, So anyways, yeah, right. The impact, of course, is considerable. We had a lot of programs with a lot of data for, so we knew that the median time for a successful program was 13 months and about 60 of these design, make, test learning cycles. in that pilot that we did, we shrunk it down to half the time and 1/3 the learning cycles to get to, the best quality outcome that we've ever gotten in terms of quality molecule leads that we then passed on. So it was had a huge impact for that program, but also had a lasting impact for the organization because people really took notice, said, what did you do? What can we learn from this, and how to apply it and spread it throughout the rest of R&D. So that was it. It was all about changing the conversation and connecting some dots, essentially.
Fantastic.
Well worth spending the time doing.
Awesome. Alice, you have a question. First of all, Patrick, thank you for sharing that. And I just want to emphasize, think about what 6 months preserved through the pipeline, and then maybe add another month here, another month there, or subtract another month here, another month there. What that means in terms of helping people feel better, do more, live longer, right?
Yeah.
So really inspirational. Alice, do we have time for, I think we got time maybe for one question.
Okay.
And maybe if there's one directed to Patrick, that'd be even better.
Yeah, I mean, there are several, we have a number of questions, and I'll just also tell people that we'll get back to you with your questions as well, like after we finish the webinar. So we don't want to leave you hanging. We do have quite a few questions. And then one of them for Patrick is like, what things help to change the culture?
Oh yeah, that's a tough one. It was a long process. I think in the sort of small team environment, to change the culture, one of the things that's important is you need allies. If it's just one person trying to change the culture, you can almost never do it. You need 2 or 3 people, and especially the leaders, to live in to what they're preaching and walk the walk. Be vulnerable, make their thinking visible, admit problems, and also explain, why we're doing this. Essentially, like this webinar, what's behind it? What are we trying to achieve? Otherwise, it may seem negative or punitive to start pointing out people's problems, right? And then people will, reject that and will shut down. It's very difficult to do, but it's well worth the time and effort, because also, I'll point out, that kind of environment, once we got it much better than it was before about teaching and learning, it doesn't just, collapse timelines and give you better metrics. It also leads to better people who are happier at the end of the day, that have learned something from that experience, and are just more engaged employees, happier to be there. So that's the intangible that's also very important.
Yeah. Hey, Patrick, I think that's a fantastic way to a fantastic point on which to end here, because you think about Mr. Toyota and this idea of Jidoka and the broken thread. Yes, he was responding to the broken thread, but really what was his concern? It was someone showing up to do work that they thought someone else would appreciate and being sabotaged in doing something valuable with those minutes of those hours, which would never ever be returned to them. And essentially what you guys did is you took away the physical manifestation of difficulty, but with exactly the same principle as Mr. Toyota had 150 years ago, which is, why should someone with the education, the aspirations, the talent you all have, why should they show up and waste any of that time rather than use that time productively to meet society's needs? So anyway, I just appreciate you sharing that story. It's fantastic. As Alice alluded in the follow-up, for all of those of you who were watching, we'll follow up when this is recorded and available. We'll share it with you. We got some documents we'll share with you. And to the questions, don't feel that was pointless, right? Because that would be sort of anti-Jidoka. We'll collect the questions, process them, Patrick and me, and we'll send out to the group as a whole thought out answers. So thank you for putting them in. Couldn't get to all of them right now, but we will respond. And Alice, I guess back to you to close up for today.
Yes, we will absolutely respond, and we did record the session, so we'll be sharing that out in an email tomorrow. And if you have any follow-up questions that you didn't have a chance to ask in the question panel, please send those along as well. And I personally really enjoyed this presentation, so thanks very much, Steve and Patrick, for you sharing your time, and for all of you who attended. We had very good attendance today, so thanks very much, everyone.
All right, be well, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great day.